All right, Sunny, I think we'll go ahead and formally begin.
Okay.
So you can end the slideshow. Uh, well, thank you, everyone. We are gathered here to celebrate the completed life of George Randall West. He was born on June 13th, 1933, and his life was pronounced whole and complete on May 31st, 2021. My name is Terry, and I am located in Chicago. During the next hour, with people around the world on Zoom, we will mark the significance in general of the journey through life and death by every person through songs, sacred poetry, and a spirit reflection. Before then, spending an extended period of time sharing stories in particular about George's life. George was a global citizen, so it is appropriate that we're doing this memorial as a global event. Therefore, I invite you to please type your name in the chat box along with your current location so we can highlight the international perspective of this. As the host of this event, I will be inviting people to participate at different points during the service. Our Zoom technician, Sunny Walker, who is in Denver, will keep everyone on mute. Therefore, when you're invited to speak, you'll need to unmute yourself. And in order to reinforce that international scope of our time today, please identify yourself and your location again when you speak. And let me just say that if we have problems with Zoom, we're not going to worry about it. We'll just pause, we'll correct it, and then we'll move on. In order to go ahead and begin, we will start with a song by Leela Philbrook, who also resides in Chicago, as an appropriate means of celebrating life's journey. Our reading this morning would be by Judith Hamji in Oak Park, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. Judith, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Yes, I'm going to be reading my Judith Hamji. The prologue from The Saviors of God by Nikos Kazantzakis. We come from a dark abyss, we end in a dark abyss, and we call the luminous interval life. As soon as we are born, the return begins. At once, the setting forth and the coming back. We die in every moment. And because of this, many have cried out, the goal of life is death. But as soon as we are born, we begin the struggle to create, to compose, to turn matter into life. We are born in every moment. And because of this, many have cried out, the goal of ephemeral life is immortality. In the temporary living organism, these two streams collide. The ascent toward composition, toward life, toward immortality. The descent toward decomposition, toward matter, toward death. And both streams well up from the depths of primordial essence. Life startles us at first. It seems somewhat beyond the law, somewhat contrary to nature, somewhat like a transitory counteraction to be the dark, eternal fountains. But deeper down, we feel that life is itself without beginning, an indestructible force of the universe. Otherwise, from where did that superhuman strength come, which hurls us from the unborn to the born and gives us plants, animals, people, courage for the struggle? But both opposing forces are holy. It is our duty, therefore, to grasp that vision which can embrace and harmonize these two enormous, timeless, and indestructible forces and with this vision to modulate our thinking and action.
Thank you, Judith. It was planned for Larry Ward to say a few words as a spirit reflection on the significance of life and death. Unfortunately, logistical and technical problems have intervened, and he will be unable to do this. Therefore, Dick Alton will now share some thoughts with us. Dick? Dick, I'm going to suggest that you would write out your reflection, and we will send it out when we send the recording and the like, because I know you've done some work on this, and we'll look forward to looking at it. But I think now let's go ahead and move forward with our program. We wanted to share some stories. With several others, Dick was a driving force in an online program called The Final Chapter. Some of you may have participated in this program. One of the real valuable spirit exercises that I found in participating in this was working on writing my own obituary. Obituaries are often read in memorial services like this. However, it was difficult to compile before this event an obituary for George. For example, I knew at one time George served as a campus chaplain at a university in Iowa. But though I inquired with as many people as I possibly could who I thought might know something about that, I could never discover the name of that university in Iowa. And the thought crossed my mind, maybe somebody here might know that. Similarly, I know George was the recipient of an honorary doctorate from another university. But likewise, I don't know the name of that university. Maybe somebody else does here. Well, therefore, we're going to create a working obituary about George during the next half hour or so. And we're going to do that by, first of all, having some designated representatives from the family, from colleagues, and from friends telling stories about George. And we're going to begin with those designated persons, but then afterwards, we're spontaneously going to open up the floor and give an opportunity for anybody who's here in this on this event to share a story. And in order to do that, we're going to see if we can find a Zoom tool to work. And that is the putting your hand up. And down at the bottom, there are different options that are there. And I think it's in the category of reactions. And you can find there, is that right, Sunny? Is it reactions where people would?
Actions, yeah.
Yeah, you can raise your hand in reactions, and that will queue up people who have something to share. And then I will call on and recognize people to do that. And we're going to do this until we approach the top of the hour. And if we have more people who have stories to share that we don't have time to hear here, I'm going to invite them to likewise write them up, and we will share them, compile them, and share them when we send out a link to this event for the future. Now, to begin, Kathy Cawthon, Donna Marie and George's granddaughter, will represent the family. And Kathy, please unmute yourself and tell us some of your memories about George.
I'm George's granddaughter. I live in Indiana. I will start when I was 8 years old, and I flew to Mexico to stay with George and Grandma when they were starting to build their house. They were living on Jorge Castro's property right on the beach, and they had a pretty elaborate setup with a camper and tent and enclosed screen area and a big tarp to cover everything to create a outdoor kitchen and living space. I stayed in the camper and they slept in the tent, but it was the rainy season. So most nights I would wake up and find George and Grandma battling the building up water on the tarp, trying to push it off. And inevitably they would fail. Their tent would flood, the tarp would fall, and I'd wake up with them sleeping in the camper with me. George spent most of his days working, I guess probably on ICA things I didn't know at the time. But every morning and every afternoon we would go swimming in the ocean. I was a pretty good swimmer, but George was always a worrier. And so we had a special rope that he would tie one end around my waist and one end around his. And so that way he could rescue me if I were ever pulled out to sea. There was one day where we were paddling around and George scooped me up and went running out of the water. I had no idea why until we got out, and he said he could have sworn he saw a jellyfish, but then realized it was probably the rope floating between us. When George wasn't working, we would drive around Puerto Vallarta, I think mostly acquiring building materials and things for the house. But we would take excursions. George and I were always looking for the perfect spot to go snorkeling. And we did find one really beautiful spot once, but most of the time we were pretty tossed around in waves and didn't get to see a whole lot. When I was a kid, I was a little intimidated by George. We didn't see George and Grandma a whole lot because they were down in Latin America. But after Grandma died, George was really lonely. He lost his best friend, and he had devoted his last 10 years of his life to taking care of her. And our family is very grateful for that. But I was able to spend a great deal of time with him down in Mexico. I did what I could to make him comfortable and make his life better. I think that's what we all did down there. Mostly we watched movies, we shared meals, we chatted. But my favorite was when he introduced me to Call the Midwives. I'm a labor and delivery nurse, so he thought it would be special for me, and it was very special for both of us. Every time I came down, I would bring a new season of The Midwives until there weren't any more left to watch. And it was always entertaining because George's knowledge of female anatomy and how babies are born was pretty limited. So we would pause frequently, and I would explain to him how things worked or draw him a diagram. I miss George. I really grew attached to him at the end of his life. And I just hope that wherever he is now, he's comfortable and he's with my grandma. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Representing the order in ICA, the ICA community, is Karen Snyder. Karen, can you unmute yourself and share some stories?
Right. I was initially asked to think about or to look to see what kind of stories that Donna Marie or George wrote about in their books that they wrote about their life together. And they were both humble in their talking about themselves. They would just highlight the other people they're talking about. So if you probably know that Donna Marie wrote this book called What More Can We Ask For? And it's all about their time in Guatemala. So they loved their years in Guanacaste, Guatemala, as well as Especia, Peru. And so after they finished being in Guatemala, Donna Marie wrote this book that told those stories. So in a brief section, when you look through the whole book and all the stories that she tells about what happened in the community, she does say that there was a time where she had come back to Chicago to attend the 8-week academy. And she was to finish the academy at Thanksgiving. At the same time, there were 27 people that were to go from Iowa to Guanacaste to take materials to set up a water system in Guanacaste. So George is in Conocasta and Donna Marie's in Chicago, and she is supposed to help them get to from the O'Hare Airport onto the plane with all their equipment. And she says, and incidentally, I was also making the necessary preparations for my wedding to George West in December. So I'm not sure what year that was. My guess is it was 82 or 84. We'll see if anybody knows that year. Kathy, do you know?
And Meg's here, and I don't know either.
It was
You
Okay.
before,
know.
it was before 84.
Before 84. Okay,
Oh,
good.
absolutely. Before
All right.
that. Yeah,
Okay.
no, more
right.
like 1980 would be my guess.
Okay, let's say 80, because I think the Conocasta project started about 78. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So before Donna Marie sent these people met these people at the airport, there were 27 Iowans. They were taking equipment for this water system. She was asked if she would please talk to Eastern Airlines about them permitting these people to take this equipment with them. So it was everything from pipes and fittings and faucets and transformers that they were taking with them. And so she pulled off a miracle and got them to agree to that. And then she says, joy of joys, there was a ticket for me, but I was not to let George know in advance. I was to be a surprise package from Iowa. What a thrill when we arrived at the check-in in Guatemala City. We were given VIP treatment. We had 22 foot lockers, 20 duffel bags filled with these pipes and fittings, luggage for 28 people, and a reel of electrical line. All of this went through the check-in uneventfully. My gang insisted I should be the last person off the plane so George would be surprised. In the customs area, the Conocasta welcoming party were all standing in a semicircle around George, watching his face. I got about 4 feet from him before he saw me. Then, what a smile. We put on a bit of a show for our audience. So you saw the photo on the memorial program that just, the love that they express as they look at each other, that love from the time they met, I think, until throughout their whole lives, was always present in their lives. And that smile of George's was probably the same smile he gave to Donna Marie at that time. So then I looked at another book, which George wrote. It's called Creating Community, Finding Meaning in the Place We Live. So he knew a lot about creating community in these 20 years that he was working in community projects around the world in the 70s and 80s. And here's the way he told this story. In the community identity part of the book about telling stories. He says the best way to attack demotivating community images is to tell a new story. A new story was found in the name of a village named after a beautiful tree that was considered to be good wood because it was excellent for making furniture. A photo of the tree was placed on a large poster with the name of the village and the caption, "The people of good wood." Each household in the village received a copy of the poster to put on their walls of stick, mud, or block. The people began to think of themselves in a new light as good wood, like their name. It began a new story about how the village would pioneer an irrigation system on behalf of the nation. They eventually got a state-of-the-art irrigation system, resulting in the average annual income of the farmers increasing 10 times. The village became a site for visitors from other countries. Okay, so that was George telling the story, but he didn't say as he was writing it that this was the story of Conocasta in Guatemala, nor did he say that he had been the catalyst for the miracle happening of the irrigation system coming into the community. Instead, he had helped them, the community people, to dream their dream and implement their vision, and resulted in this miracle. But he was such a humble man that he did not give himself any credit. But I know that he was instrumental in making that happen. So one of the things that I think about as I think of these stories and others is that the West left as part of their legacy these two books, and they made them available to the archives website so that you too can read and scan what they've written as you wish. So I'll put a link to where these books are located in the chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. Representing the Litibu Eco Village community in Mexico is Salvatore Caruso. So Salvatore, if you could unmute yourself and share some stories about George and our community in Litibu.
Well, good to be with you all on this very special occasion. Can you hear me okay? Oh, great. Well, listening to the story so far, I'm picking up on what Kathy said. I mean, the humorous side of George coming out in his later years, it really strikes me, because I was there for the midwives episodes, which was very humorous and a very softer and funnier side of George. Of course, some of the other images we had go back all the way to the academy and some of the more strict things that were much more disciplined George, although he was disciplined throughout his whole life. As you all know, he come across as very professorial, but at the same time, he was, as I say, very, very funny. For me, and I want to tell a few stories here in one moment. You know, he's always very, kind of like caring and wise and cool and comprehensive and process. And the word that strikes me more than anything is equanimity. I think that's something he had a real way of dealing with it in such a way. He wouldn't use that word, of course, but he was always very comprehensive. George kept notes and files. And Kathy's smiling, as you know, and we went through a lot of them. He had information that went back decades and details, because one of George's principles that still carries on in many of us is that if you're going to do something significant of anything, build something or say something or have a proposal, make sure you have 3 different bids. Make sure you have 3 different points of view. So he would triangulate all the time. And that really kind of postponed making a really rapid decision. And so that gets me to really focusing on Litibu. Litibu is kind of a sacred place. It's kind of like the book we read with Katsantzakis not Katsantzakis, but that was a great story. Going back, the journey to Ixtlan, Carlos Castaneda. Journey to Litibu was, we just celebrated a couple years ago our 3 decades of being a eco-village. That we evolved to becoming an eco-village. And George's footprints and handprints are just all over that land. Kathy described even down by the ocean in the carry. He took on everything. He was always being very careful and triangulating everything. And that's the nature of some of the stories. I'm just quick stories. They're more images than they are complete stories. But one was, he along with myself and particularly Fred Lamphere and Nancy helped create the Sacred Garden in Litibu. It's on the ocean. Some of you have been there, and your fingerprints and footprints and breath and breathing are in that space. But George, again, was the kind of, person that looked at all aspects. Everyone was looked at with George. George and Fred were like, twins, because Fred had that same kind of characteristic as well. And so they created with some vision and some other aspects that we did together, we created a beautiful space with 5 gardens. And it was dedicated to my deceased wife, who was also part of the community, Cheryl. And so it was a blessing. And Nancy, if she were on, she was helping, I mean, incredibly. One little side story, probably talking to George, is the 5 designated spots were unmarked. They were only visualized in our minds as we walked through the garden. And one morning I walk out there, and there's these 5 signs of the 5 names of the gardens in each spot that had been put there. And George helped with that, and Nancy and Fred. So building the Peace Garden has been a great thing that's been available to the entire community and the broader community for these almost 3 decades, not quite that long, 2 decades for sure. And another story I would tell that's adjoining that really is, and I mentioned Cheryl, that when she passed and wanted to come to Litibu after a year of deep sorrow, talking with George and helping structure a celebration of life, much like this, but this time on the ground in Litibu. And George really helped me tremendously by orchestrating it. We talked about it. He was able to be the kind of the role of the father at that point, you know, and helping us going through this process that was so beautifully illustrated by the Savior's reading, particularly. And you know, we talked about how to make it sacred, and using the garden was not there then. It was unmarked, but we walked in there, and that's how the space became much more sacred. Although anybody even walking in that space before all this, you could feel that something special happens around that space, because the indigenous people many years earlier would use that space to wash clothes. Anyhow, we created that together, the ceremony, taking her ashes, spreading them into the garden and taking them down, those who were there, down to the sea. And George was very helpful in, as I said, in kind of orchestrating that kind of the father role, the pastor role, which he served in many, many ways throughout the 3 decades. What a legacy. And maybe one last little story about our community. For those again who have not been there, our community has a on the maps for that they have in the municipality. One of our spaces, it's a road that kind of goes. It's a little pathway that goes through our community. It's a designated street. And at some point, some of the folks our neighbors wanted more access to the beach and wanted another street to be open, which would have really divided our community in 2 pieces, and potential with kids going back and forth. So George, again, getting out his files, and we figured out a plan on how we would create a way of saving this for a garden that would be available and a pathway to the beach to everyone, to our Mexican hosts, as well as any of our community. He dug out notes that we had agreements with way in the beginning with some of the municipality in the village of Higuera Blanca that gave us permission to make access to the beach informally, and he had written statements in his files that we dug out, that we eventually took to the municipality and said, this is what you have granted us informally many years ago. As a result, that street was never opened up for traffic. And he just, again, you know, it's one of the little things that held the community, the glue that held us together, because of George's diligence and triangulating in such a way, getting the 3 bids like he would always do. So I think, like Karen just said, I think another thing that I would add to his legacy, there's 3 decades of being kind of the guardian of the community in establishing the future for us and handing it off to us, and now we're doing that again with the kind of membership kind of drive that we have now to pass it along to more members. So I would conclude with that.
All righty. Thank you very much, Salvatore. Well, now we want to open this up to sharing stories by anyone who is a part of this this service. If you have a story to share and you haven't already put your hand up, raise your hand in the Zoom feature down there. Please do. And as the host, I will do my best in an orderly fashion to try to call upon and recognize people to share a story. And again, I would just remind you, please give us your name and where in the world you are currently residing and the like. So hopefully you've been thinking about some short stories to share. So please raise your hands and I'll do my best to call upon people and in an order. Kaz, I see your hand up. Could you share something? Yeah, please. Yeah, good.
Yes, thank you. Well, I knew George back in 1965, and he never talked. I mean, he never said a word. He was the most silent person I'd ever met. We were on the west side of Chicago, and he never said anything. And he smoked a pipe in those days. And when he did actually say something, you know, we'd go around the room, he'd be very gentle, but primarily he didn't talk. So several years passed, and he and I were assigned to teach the North Shore Cadre, who later became the Guardians. Now, the North Shore Cadre, men and women, were a very cohesive group, and they were thinking of all moving together into one place. So they had gotten a motel for us to teach CS1. I never taught with George. I never heard him talk very much. So I was sort of excited to figure out, you know, what we were going to do. Well, we met Friday night for about 5 minutes and decided I would start off with the first lecture and then we'd rotate, you know, so forth and so on. And he said he wasn't feeling very well. He didn't look very well. So we all get together with the North Shore Cadre and they start passing around bottles of whiskey or gin or whatever. This is usual. And George and I didn't say anything. We just waited until everybody had a drink. And I gave the lecture and he got up to do the seminar. And he says, "I'm sick." And he walks out the room. Well, we sent somebody after him and they came back and they said, "He is really sick." Well, we saw no more of George that weekend. I mean, absolutely no more of George. And so I taught the class, doing all parts, trying to remember, you know, right before I did it, what exactly I was supposed to be doing. And I went by to see George and he wouldn't open the door. You know, I mean, he was really sick. He says, "I'm just going to sleep." So when it was all over, George comes out of his room, still dressed very, very nicely and so forth. About that, I hope it went well. That was the end of the conversation. I never heard another word out of George, either that weekend or afterwards. So my memory of George West really was a very quiet gentleman. And as long as I've known him, I never really changed my opinion. Of course, by that time I'd gone overseas, so I was no longer where he was, but I only knew him in the very early days of the order. But I remember how quiet he was. That's it.
All righty. Thank you very much, Kaz. Doug and Pat, you have a story to share?
Yes, there's two of us. So we actually have two stories.
Oh,
And the first one involves with George as our teacher. And of course, his teaching style was very unique and in the moment, whether he was there or not, it seems like. And I think I'll let Pat tell the story about the Bonhoeffer weekend that we spent with George, which was really a Bonhoefferan experience.
Well, by this time we'd moved to the north side. So having spent almost, Friday night and all day Saturday on paragraph 3, it was time to go to a movie. And since we were on the north side, we could, get easily to a movie, much more so than on the west side. So he had us look through newspapers and what movie do we want to see? And we figured out one and said so. And people talk about he didn't have much of a sense of humor, but with that serious face, there was always something sort of grinning behind it. And he just looked at everybody and said, well, is that the will of God? And it just exploded and people go, oh, we were supposed to do the will of God. And then they started figuring it out over again. And we went through this whole process again. And then we said,
observe,
okay,
judge,
let's do this movie. And he just sort of smiled and said, is that the will of God? And whoo, it starts up again. And I don't know, I think 5 or 6 times he just quietly asked, is that the will of God? And I kept thinking, we don't know what movie we went to, but we did eventually pick one and go.
And we were still not sure whether it was the will of God or not.
Oh, of course it was.
The second story was we had the fortunate experience of spending a week with George and Donna Marie in their Liddy-Boo home. This was in the New Year's, I think it was 2009.
Yeah.
And we had decided to do a Mexican vacation. And it was a wonderful experience to be in the Liddy-Boo community and to really meet and experience Donna Marie as well as George. I remember especially it was great because in the evening we would watch the evening news with George and Donna Marie. I tried to tease some stories out of Donna Marie about their time in kind of book. So I read the book, Karen. It's an excellent book, and everybody should have an opportunity to read that. I won't dwell on the story very long, but we were in the middle of a crisis with the ICA. I had just recently joined the board of the ICA, and this was a time when many of you experienced being fired or let go by the ICA. And a lot of people in Liddy-Boo were basically on the outs with the ICA, I would say at that point. In other words, no way would they ever in hell step in that building again. And but we needed board members. We had a crisis on the board. And so George and I went through the directory and started making a list. Well, what I wanted to talk to about being on the board were they're in Liddy-Boo at the time. So there was the Scotts, the Gilberts were there, Troxels were there. And so we go down and the tactic that I worked out with George was, well, we'd ask, we talked to Karen Schneider and we says, okay, who would you recommend to be on the board? And so I'd get names and write them down. And then later we went back and we went and talked to those people, Karen and Ken Gilbert and David Scott, and said, we want you to be on the board. Oh no, I'm not going. Things, we have the archives website, and a lot of the things came out of that. But George was kind of instrumental in helping. He was all excited about building a strategy and the tactics and working all of that out. And it was a wonderful time to stay in their home with George and Donna Marie.
All righty. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doug. Martha Laird, could you share a story, and then we have a couple more we'll try to get in before we end.
Yes, two very quick stories. It's interesting that the name of his book was Finding, or part of his book was Finding Community in the Place We Live, because my story is about how he could really find the sacred in every single daily activity, particularly through those conversations we used to have called spirit conversations. He could tell one heck of a sacred story out of the most mundane thing you've ever seen happen. So he would just bleed the meaning right out of it and into it. The other one is I had the honor of being on a sort of a semi-ITI that George put together out of Caracas when he and Rose were assigned there. And it was with the people from the Catholic Anglican Church in Jamaica. And it was really interesting to watch, amazing to watch George relate to the villagers from Caracas and Caño Negro and the Anglican bishops from Jamaica. And he could do them both with such deep dignity and respect.
Thank you very much. Jan Sanders, do you have a story to tell? Unmute yourself.
Yes. Well, it's kind of a continuation of Kay's story, and also Martha. I met George. I had taken 2 courses with the Ecumenical Institute. First was Imaginal Education, and then RS1. And my third course was, I believe, RS3A, and which was Church and Community. And George was the key teacher of that. I would never have guessed. Maybe he was too shy to teach with K's or what, but the professor is what came out. He had this wonderful tweed jacket and or corduroy jacket with the patches on it, and he looked was smoking his pipe. I was fascinated with the stories of community and the stories that came out of Fifth City. And it was the first time I had ever experienced, I mean, it's a standard piece now, but breaking into groups and doing some visioning or problem solving. And we would go into our little teams and we would huddle, and he was, guiding all of us around in this process, and then would thoughtfully listen to our responses when we came back, and, honored the wisdom that came out and just guided us so beautifully through that whole time of looking at church and community. And it was during that time that I saw the power, I guess, of what the Ecumenical Institute was doing. The real on the ground, boots in the mud kind of thing was through his stories, and they came alive. And I just really wanted to say that I did tell him that once when I went to Liddy Boo, and the role that his life and his vision and his words played in my own life, and that ripple effect. And so today, as we honor George, I just want to honor that. And I'm so delighted to see it was in a book. I've not seen that. And the story you read, Karen, about, or someone did, about the news story, is definitely, that is a line I use every time I'm in a group. What is the news story? How do we symbolize that? And so my hat's off to you, George, wherever and however you are now, and blessings for your courage, your deep courage. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. One last story. I see Judith has her hand up, and Judith, will end with you. And then if others have stories to share, please type them up. We'll compile them and put them out when we send them on. Judith, unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Please share.
Yeah. I lived with George and Donna Marie in Peru for many years. And during that time, it was after the order decided to dissolve, but we stayed living together in Peru with all these people. And so it was George and Donna Marie and Mitzi Moore and myself. And so every day we would eat our meals together, and George would cook oatmeal every morning. And so that was part of it. But the big story for me that was a life-changing one, he was leading Collegium one day, and he looked at me and he said, "Are you angry? It's okay if you are you?" I said, "No, why would you say that?" And he'd say, "Because of the expression on your face, like you're frowning." He made me aware after the Collegium or something, you'd say, "That was great." What was great about it? Tell me the 3 points. I mean, he never lets you get off with just giving a quick response. It was always pushing the depth so that you reflected on that. I mean, George was one of the best mentors in my life. I was in Liddy Boo, and we'd call on the phone. I talked to him probably a week before he died. Just when my mother died in the States, he called me from Mexico to Massachusetts. I mean, just an incredible, incredible spirit man that I would just never forget.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, Judith. Well, again, if anyone else has any stories to share, please send them, and I'll compile them, and we'll send those forth. I would suggest to you all that some in the world might look at our Zoom hour that we've spent together and say, that was full of a lot of imperfections. And yet I feel like it's entirely appropriate in celebrating the completed life of George West, because imperfections that the world might see, George was ready to declare whole and complete and perfect in themselves. And with that thought, I'm going to thank you for coming to this service and send you forth into the world. Amen.